Okay, so this is for fall typography class, kind of a freebie. I'm showing how we're going to colorize something that we've drawn using a non-photo blue pencil, and we've already scanned it, which I don't have during the recording, and I've opened it in Illustrator. But we're going to learn how to image trace. So I have placed my drawing that I did into Illustrator, and I'm using my black arrow tool, known as the selection tool. When that image is not selected, on the control panel, image trace does not show up. But when the image is selected, image trace does show up. Now, I prefer to use custom image tracing, and there's a little arrow off to the side of image trace, and the word custom is grayed out, so I can't access it here. However, if I'm not going to use custom image trace on this image, sometimes I use the black and white logo predetermined tracing settings, and it will trace that line work into what is now a vector path. If I want a lot more control over it, which indeed I do, I'm going to hit Command Z. And if you want a lot more control over your image tracing, move him over, we would go to Window, Image Trace, which is about halfway down, and we get this image trace window. Now, what I do with this image trace window is I click on the Advanced button, the flyout button, which is a little arrow, and I also click on the Preview button, which in essence traces it, shows you the tracing result. And if I wanted things looser or lower or high tolerance, I can adjust it. So right now, my threshold, if I put it at more, it's going to thicken it up a little bit, which I wanted it a little thicker anyway. For the paths, it's going to either have a high threshold or a low threshold. High fitting means it's going to be more exact to my drawing. Low fitting will kind of ad lib a little bit and maybe even smooth out some of my imperfections. Now, sometimes it adds little corner areas too. Now in corners, you can do more corners or less corners. So one will feel a little bit more choppy. I want mine to look a little bit smoother. And for noise, if I had any little specks from scanning, I can take the noise down a little bit. But right now, when I add or take away noise, it doesn't do anything because my thing was clean in the first place. So it's kind of about whether or not you had any cleanup to do with little excess points anywhere. So I'm going to adjust this until I really like what I see. And let's say I like this. So when I'm done with this, in essence, the preview is tracing it. I don't have to tell it to trace. I don't like the wobbly lines, so I'm going to try to, there we go, that's better. So it's traced it. When I close it, it's traced. Now, what I have to do is I have to expand this artwork so I can colorize it. So if I had this as an illustrated initial letter, this would be beautiful. But I need to expand it so that I can deal with the individual parts and pieces and color them. So as long as I have the black arrow tool, known as the selection tool, selected, and the artwork is selected, the expand button is up here on the top in the control panel. So I click expand, and you will see that it now has various paths. Now it also puts a white background around everything, which I don't necessarily want. So typically I will use my direct selection tool, which is the white arrow tool, and I will click out in the gray space away from the artboard and then drag just over, coming in contact with that background. And I hit delete twice, and now there is no more path back there. I'm clicking and there's no more path back there. Now to colorize this, let me bring up my swatches panel. Normally I make my own swatches, but there's plenty here I can work with, assuming it's going to come up here. Hello, swatches. Window, swatches. Okay, we're having some problems possibly with, there we go, my minimize or maximize view. Not a whole lot of swatches here. Usually by default it'll have a bunch of them, but it's missing them, so I am going to bring in my Swatch Library. So I fly out to the edge, just in case you ever have this problem. Go to the flyout menu, which is in the upper right-hand corner. Go to Open Swatch Library, and I'll go ahead and go to Color Books because I can get my Pantone CMYK coded or uncoded, depends on what kind of paper I'm on. So let's just do coded. And I'll have all of the Pantone colors coming up in this, this swatch panel. So here I can just use these. And if I choose to use a Pantone color, say for his hat, maybe I choose this red. By clicking on it, it puts it in the swatches panel so I can use it over and over again because I don't want to go digging through this. So let's say his ball cap is red, and let's say, I'm going to hold down the shift key, let's say that his H and his little button on top are a blue color. So let me get a blue color. And let's say this brim is also that blue color, but the under brim is shadowed, so I'm going to use a dark blue there. Super easy to colorize. I don't know what color. We'll make Humpty's eyes blue, or let's make him red. Let's make him Devil Humpty. No, let's make him blue. And his nose should be a nice bright red, not that orange red. So let's choose a different red for that. His tongue should also be that red, and that should probably be black inside of his mouth. So I gotta go find a black color. And I also might make his little eyebrows black. So I just finished colorizing Humpty. I also think these should probably be black, so let me put that in there. And then if you wanted him to appear as if he has little highlights, sometimes I draw in little shapes, fill them with white. We are missing all sorts of colors in here. And that's not very well drawn, but you get the idea. Put little highlights in here because he's kind of a shiny guy. So that's super quick and easy. So we just drew Humpty. If I weren't talking through this, I would have drawn him, scanned him, and colored him in less than 10 minutes. Not bad. So let me save him. Now normally we save Illustrator files as EPSs, and we haven't gone through that yet here in this classroom as to what file types we save them as, but normally we would save anything vector as an EPS. That way when I place him in Illustrator or InDesign, he functions properly. So there's Illustrator. Now oftentimes I will go ahead and reopen my line work, re-image trace him, and take him into Photoshop because he'll have a little bit better line quality. So I don't want it all pixely looking, and I want the line quality to be smoothed out. So I'm going to go ahead and image trace him again. Now hopefully it remembers what I had last time. Oops, let me select him, then preview, then he's going to trace, so that's fine. As long as preview's on, it's tracing. And then I'm going to get rid of the white background. Oops, not the whole thing. Let's expand it first before we do that. Then get rid of the white background. Oh, excuse me, let's use the white arrow tool for that. And then I'm going to export this as a Photoshop file. I don't know if it's export or save as. I think it's export. Export as, and then we're going to choose Photoshop. So that way Photoshop will understand what this is. Now when I hit export, it's going to ask me what resolution and that kind of stuff. So I want this high resolution, and you want anti-aliasing off or none. Anti-aliasing will turn that black line into, it'll still be black, but the edges will go kind of a gray because it softens between one color and another, and the background is white, so it would soften those. So I turn the anti-aliasing off. So I'm going to open this guy in Photoshop, and we're going to show you the difference between the scan that I did and the image trace, and we'll see that there is a quality difference. So here is the scan that I did in 300 pixels per inch, and then here is the image trace that I did, which is still 300 pixels per inch, but you can see, let me flatten that, or I'll put a white background behind it. Let me fill that with white and send it to the back. There's a million different ways to do this, but this is just how I'm doing it right now. So the line work looks very much cleaner on the one that I image traced. You can still see a little pixelization there, but oops, let's minus this. So sometimes I do go into Illustrator and then bring it back to Photoshop. So I'm going to work with this guy. Now I did create a layer underneath the Humpty guy. That would be maybe my background layer. I typically will lock that. It's just white. I fill it with white, and I create another layer on top of that. I would assume you guys know how to use Photoshop, and you know that the new layer button is next to the little trash can. Can't assume that, but that's how you create a new layer. Now the Humpty Dumpty layer here, you want to make sure that any line art layer is set, instead of its blending mode to normal, you want that to be multiply. And the reason why is you want the colors to kind of show through, and we also don't want the anti-aliasing happening. So we're going to be toggling between the Humpty layer and the layer 2, which I'm going to rename Colorization. Now, the hardest part for me is remembering what layer I'm on, which I'm sure is also a pretty hard part for you. So I'm going to go to my Humpty layer, and I'm going to grab, say, the Magic Wand tool. This is also, you could also do the Quick Select tool. Let me hit Command D to make sure nothing's selected. And let's say I wanted to colorize the hat, this red. Maybe it's the same color red as the nose and the tongue. So I'm going to click on all 3 of those. Now here's the deal. I do not want to put the color inside of my line art layer. I want to put it in my colorization layer. So those are still selected, but I'm on my colorization layer. And I'm going to choose a red for his nose. And I'm going to fill this with this foreground color. So I went to Edit, Fill, and I choose the foreground color because that's what's selected here. I might also stroke that just so that later on when I'm adding some filters and effects that I want this to be a little bit bigger than the line art. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Edit, and I'm going to stroke this, excuse me, and I'm going to stroke it with the foreground color and a couple of pixels, maybe 3 pixels or so. So what's going to happen is this is 3 pixels wider than the selection. I might even do it 5 because 3 to, or maybe 10. That's a pretty big drawing. There we go. But when I turn my line artwork off, you can see I'm just dealing with the colorization underneath. I go back to my line art layer, and let's say I want the button to be blue. Let me deselect everything. The button to be blue. I'm holding down the Shift key. The H to be blue. The rim of the hat to be blue. Excuse me, it's having a moment. Let me use my Magic Wand tool instead. And his eyes might be the same color blue. So I grab all the elements that are blue, make it whatever color blue I want. Let's go with a lighter blue. And then I go back to the colorization layer. That's the thing I got to remember. Go back to that layer, and I want to fill it with that foreground color, and I also want to stroke it about 10 points, assuming my line art is thick enough. Now this isn't all magical yet, but it's going to be here in just a second. Now I do want to fill his eyebrow with black or even maybe a dark brown. So I'm going to go back to my Humpty layer, hold down the Shift key. I'll just fill these with black, same thing with his mouth. And I'm going to choose a black. I'm going to fill it and I'm going to stroke it. Fill it with the foreground color and stroke it with the foreground color, about 10 pixels. Now if my line work were thinner, I wouldn't stroke it quite that much. So I'm not ready to quite get rid of this yet, but you can see when I turn off my, oops, I was on the wrong layer. Woo! When I turn my Humpty layer off, I accidentally filled and stroked the eyeball area. So let me step backward just a bit and make sure I am on the correct layer before I fill and stroke this area, because that happens to me more than I'd like to admit. Edit, stroke. There we go. Now I'll turn that off and you'll see that Humpty kind of looks like a piece of stained glass in a way. It looks really weird. Now I will go into, maybe I want to colorize the egg, or I also have to colorize his underneath the hat. So let me grab the underneath side of his hat, go back to the colorization layer, grab a darker blue there, and fill it with that and stroke it. Now the fun really comes in the paintbrushes. You can download paintbrushes. There's all sorts of great paintbrushes. I tend to just go with the airbrush on this. Unlock that layer. I will lock the Humpty layer, which is the line art layer. I don't want to paint on this on accident, so I'm going to go ahead and lock that. But I'm going to get my paintbrush tool, and I am going to use a softer brush, almost like an airbrush. And I can adjust the size. Make sure I'm on the right layer when I do this. And the hardness, I really want it kind of soft. And I do want it fairly sizable. And I can even adjust the opacity of this. I might take that down. I certainly usually take the flow down as well. But I'm going to start popping in some highlights, shadows, highlights, midtone, and shadow detail here. So for, let's say the egg itself, I'm going to use a fairly light blue. And I'm going to start blasting in some shadow detail in his cheeks, underneath his little chin there, maybe up under his hat. Oops, I got to be careful about that eyebrow. Let me make my guy a little smaller. I might want to blow some stuff. Oops, this should probably be on its own layer. So let me create another layer, and I am going to paint these details in this layer so I don't screw everything else up. And put that layer there. There we go. So we might want to paint highlights and midtones and shadows in their own layer. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to do this kind of sloppy. I'm also going to paint some in this hat. Let's see. I'm going to put him on top. It's going to be sloppy a little bit. Let's make that a little darker. There we go. I'm painting some details, shadows in his hat. Let me make that even darker. And I don't know how well you can see it on the overhead. Just putting some little details in here. And it looks pretty crappy because I'm not being really careful, but I don't have to be. Let me paint some red details in for his tongue. I want to get some little bit of detail in here. Maybe some down below here. And since tongues are kind of, for lack of a better word, juicy, or moist, we could use the word moist because everybody loves that word. I might put in some highlight details in his nose, in his eyes, along his hat. That's probably about it. Pretty minimal coloring on Humpty. I also might use a fairly light grayish blue for his, more for his shell. I want to get a little bit more detail in the shell. I'm going to take the brush and make it fairly big, and I'm going to really take the opacity and the flow down. So I'm going to put some down in here. You may not be able to see it on the overhead, I'm not sure. A little bit. And I just start popping in some of these details. And when I'm done, I'm going to put some in his eyeballs too. Now when I'm done with the shadow stuff, I will turn off my colorization layer and unlock my Humpty layer. And I am going to, with Magic Wand, go to the line art layer. I'm going to select the exterior of this guy, in case I got sloppy. I'm going to go back to my shadows layer, and I'm just going to hit the delete key. So it's going to delete anything that went rogue. And then I'm going to go to my colorization layer. Let's see, I'm going to go here. Let's see, what do I want to do? I want to delete, deselect there. I'm going to delete, gotta get in the right layer. I'm going to delete the extraneous stuff that I have in his eyebrows. So I grab those, I go back to layer 2, delete that, clean those out. I'm going to turn my colorization layer on and make sure I didn't get too crazy on some stuff. It looks like I need to, on my colorization layer, I need to delete what's in this hat. So I'm going to select this area on there, go back to layer 2, and then hit maybe delete. Let's see if I screw something up. Oh, I didn't want that. I got crazy. That's okay. Now this isn't all that exciting right now. You're like, well, it's a little bit more, it's got a little bit more continuous tone look than Illustrator stuff. But what I like to do is I like to turn off the line art layer. It looks kind of funny, but I like to turn that layer off, and I like to maybe merge these two layers. Let me unlock that. I'm going to merge those visible layers. Gosh, where is the flyout menu? There we go. Merge visible layers. There we go. And I'm going to run a filter on just that layer. So I'm going to have this layer selected. I'm going to select all. And I can run all sorts of different filters. Let me make sure this is in RGB mode. So I go to Image Mode, RGB, because the filters won't work in CMYK mode, many of them. So I have to work in RGB and then convert it back. So I'm going to go to Filter, and let's say I wanted to look like some sort of Andy Warhol thing or Roy Lichtenstein thing. Let me go to Color Halftone, and I'll start with 8 and see what happens. And that looks pretty cool. So the line art is intact, but then the shadows, the midtones, and the colors have turned to halftone. Now this looks really fun on typography as well. So there's one filter effect that I did. Oftentimes, if I just want it to look like airbrush, I go to Filter and I add some noise, and so it softens that a little bit. I usually use Gaussian versus uniform. It's more random. And then I usually also add a slight blur. Let's just do a Gaussian blur. And that kind of softens that up a little bit, but yet what it does is the line art is still intact. It's still nice and strong. Again, I'm sorry the monitor's making this look kind of crummy. But you can see that the line art is still intact. Now I also might go back to this line art and I might select some of this black that's I know is in the line art. Let's say that nose part. I'm going to select similar, and I'm going to go fill this with a rich black because right now it's kind of an off black. So let me make this a rich black, which would be 30 cyan, 30 magenta, 30 yellow, and 100 black. I'm going to fill that with that color because I don't want anything showing through. So I just made that rich black, and when I zoom in, we shouldn't be able to see colors shining through there. That was part of that multiply blending mode. So just a quick and dirty colorization. It was kind of a fun thing to do, and it looks a little bit more continuous tone than the Illustrator one. The Illustrator one is really flat. So we have a flat Illustrator one, and then we have a more continuous tone, has highlights, midtones, and shadows, one with depth. And you can have a lot of fun, again, with some of these filter effects. So it's just lots of fun. All right. So for this project, if you wanted to include maybe an Illustrator drop cap, Illustrator initial, these techniques I'm sharing with you could be used on that. But Bart Rivers showed me this technique back in, well, a while back, before I started teaching here. And I used to do everything by hand and used to do a lot of watercolor effects and stuff like that. I can do all that in Photoshop, so that way, if I mess up, it's not the end of the world. I can hit Command Z, so it's really fun. Lots of fun stuff, and you can get really great artwork done in no time at all. So I hope you enjoyed that. Any questions? All right, so there was a freebie.